a boy named George Owen Smith vanished from the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys in 1940. His family was never notified. No death certificate was ever filed. He was 11 years old. For more than a century, this institution in the Florida Panhandle operated under the guise of reform, promising to rehabilitate wayward youth and return them to society as productive citizens. The state of Florida endorsed it. Parents entrusted their children to it. And behind its walls, something far darker was unfolding, something that wouldn't fully come to light until forensic teams began exhuming bodies in 2013. What they found would force an entire state to confront a horror it had worked very hard to forget. But the graves were only part of the story. The survivors who escaped carried memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, memories of a small concrete building the boys called the White House. The school opened its doors on January 1, 1900, established by the Florida legislature as the State Reform School for Boys. It sat on 1,400 acres of farmland near Marianna, a quiet town in Jackson County. The stated mission was rehabilitation through education and vocational training. Boys as young as 5 were sent there, sometimes for crimes as minor as truancy or smoking cigarettes. From the beginning, something was wrong. A 1903 investigation revealed that boys were being whipped with leather straps and locked in dark isolation cells. The state promised reforms. Nothing changed. In 1914, a fire killed 8 boys who had been locked in their dormitory. An investigation followed. The state promised reforms. Nothing changed. This pattern would repeat itself for over 100 years. And what no one outside those walls understood, what the state seemed determined to keep buried, was that the beatings and the fires were only the beginning. The White House was a small concrete block building, painted white, set apart from the main campus. Boys who broke rules, or sometimes boys who simply caught the attention of the wrong staff member, were taken there after dark. They were forced to lie face down on a blood-stained mattress, their faces pressed into a pillow to muffle their screams. Troy Tidwell arrived at Dozier in 1959 at the age of 13. Decades later, he would describe the one-armed man who administered his beating, a janitor named R.G. Hatton, known to the boys simply as One-Armed Hatton. The instrument was a leather strap, 3 feet long, with a wooden handle. Tidwell received over 90 lashes. He counted every one. The beatings left permanent scars, physical and psychological. Robert Straley, who arrived at Dozier in 1963, would later testify that he watched a boy beaten so severely that his buttocks split open and bled through his clothing. The staff called these sessions getting 100 licks. The boys called it something else. They called it going to hell. The violence at Dozier extended far beyond the White House. Survivors would eventually describe a culture of constant terror. Boys were forced to work the school's agricultural fields from dawn until dusk, picking vegetables and tending livestock. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were beaten. Those who tried to run were beaten worse. Sexual abuse was rampant. Multiple survivors reported being assaulted by staff members, sometimes repeatedly over the course of their detention. Jerry Cooper, who was sent to Dozier in 1961 at age 12, later described being raped by a staff member in the school's dairy barn. When he reported the assault, he was beaten and placed in isolation. The school operated 2 separate campuses, one for white boys, one for black boys, reflecting Florida's Jim Crow laws. Conditions on the black campus were even more brutal. The violence there was constant and overwhelming, and the historical record is thinner because fewer survivors lived long enough to tell their stories. In 2008, a group of men who had survived Dozier began calling themselves the White House Boys. They started speaking publicly about what had happened to them, many for the first time in their lives. Roger Kaiser, who had been sent to Dozier in 1959, began writing about his experiences. Others followed. The state of Florida dismissed their accounts. Then anthropologist Erin Kimmerlow arrived. A forensic researcher from the University of South Florida, she began investigating the school's cemetery in 2012. Official records indicated 31 boys had died at Dozier over the years. But when Kimberly's team began examining the grounds with ground-penetrating radar, they found something else entirely. There were 55 burial sites, and the bodies hadn't been interred in the official cemetery. They were scattered across the property, in unmarked graves, some of them in locations the state had never acknowledged. The question of who these boys were and how they died would take years to answer. Some of it remains unanswered still. How does an institution torture and kill children for over a century? The answer lies in complicity at every level of Florida's government. Investigations were launched in 1903, 1911, 1958, and 1968. Each time, inspectors documented evidence of abuse. Each time, the state declined to close the school. In 1958, after a United States Senate subcommittee investigated juvenile detention facilities nationwide, Dozier was singled out as one of the worst in the country. The superintendent was replaced. The beatings continued. In 1968, Governor Claude Kirk ordered yet another investigation. Staff members were shuffled around. The White House was eventually closed, but only after decades of documented torture and only after thousands of boys had passed through its doors. The state's response to each new revelation followed a familiar script: express concern, make cosmetic changes, wait for public attention to fade. It worked every time. The school remained open until 2011. Between 2013 and 2016, Erin Kimmerley's team exhumed 51 sets of remains from the Dozier property. Using dental records, DNA analysis, and historical documents, they were able to identify some of the dead. George Owen Smith, the 11-year-old who vanished in 1940, was among them. His remains were returned to his family in 2014, 74 years after his death. Many of the dead showed signs of trauma: blunt force injuries, gunshot wounds, conditions consistent with violent death. The state of Florida had maintained for decades that most of these boys died from illness or accidents. The bones told a different story. Some families received closure, others never will. Of the 51 remains exhumed, only 21 were positively identified. The rest, children whose names have been lost to history, were reinterred with markers reading unknown. The Dozier School for Boys closed in June 2011, finally shuttered after 111 years of operation. By then, thousands of boys had passed through its gates. The exact number who were abused will never be known. The exact number who died will never be known either. In 2017, the Florida legislature formally apologized to the survivors. Governor Rick Scott signed the bill. The White House boys attended the ceremony. Many of them were in their 70s and 80s by then, old men carrying the weight of what had been done to them as children, still waiting for someone to believe them. The site of the Dozier School is now owned by the city of Marianna. Plans have been proposed to turn it into a memorial, but as of now, the buildings still stand: the dormitories, the administration offices, and the small white concrete building where boys were taken in the night. The boys who survived Dozier learned early that the world was not what it pretended to be. They learned that institutions meant to protect children could destroy them instead. And they learned that the truth, once buried, can stay buried for a very long time. But not forever. The dead, it turns out, have a way of speaking if anyone is willing to listen.